Nya Zhong, and welcome to the Happier Together podcast. This is episode 1, The Influence of War and Immigration on Hmong Mental Health with Dr. Alyssa Kaying Vang. Please note that there will be descriptions of mental health in this episode. Some listeners may find this disturbing. If you find yourself triggered, pause the episode and review the description box, which will include timestamps for each topic. This is to empower you, our audience, with the knowledge you need to make healthy decisions about how and if you should consume this podcast content. Also note that there will be some Hmong phrases that will be used throughout this episode. Turn on the captions or review the notes in the description box that will translate what is being said. The Hmong are an ethnic group originating from China and Southeast Asia. During the 1960s, the United States Central Intelligence Agency recruited the Hmong in Laos to help fight the secret war against the Vietnamese and Laotian communists. Many Hmong community members still have vivid memories of war, immigration, and carrying the burdens of marginalized experiences that have impacted their mental health. Dr. Alyssa Kaying Vang will describe the current and changed landscape of mental health that she supported in her notable work. Let's get into the episode. Today we have Dr. Alyssa Kaying Vang, who will be speaking on her experiences working with the Hmong community. So, Dr. Alyssa, if you can introduce yourself, describing what your educational and career background is, and also why mental health is important to you.
Well, good morning, and thank you so much for having me on your podcast. My name is Alyssa Kaying Vang, and I am a licensed psychologist. I have my doctorate in psychology and have been doing this work for quite some time, providing direct mental health services to our community. Why is mental health important to me? Mental health is often invisible to the naked eye. It's a condition that we often don't see. And so sometimes it's quite stigmatizing. But mental health is so critical to our whole sense of self. And it really encompasses many areas of our emotional, psychological, and social well being. And so our mental health really affects how we think about ourselves, how we think about other people, how we feel, and how we behave. And so our mental health also informs how we manage stress, how we relate to other people, and how we make choices, whether they're healthy choices or unhealthy choices.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alyssa, for being a part of this podcast. I just feel like you have such a rich experience in the mental health field. And so I really want to start us off with our first question, which is, what is trauma? What are some key attitudes and things that you've seen in your work from working with individuals on their mental health?
Trauma is, by definition, the lasting emotional response that often results from living through a distressing situation or an event. And so when we experience a traumatic event, it can really harm our sense of safety. It can really affect whether we feel safe or not. It can really affect how we see ourselves, our sense of self, and our ability to regulate our emotions and navigate through relationships in a way that feels healthy and constructive. Before we go into your question, I really want to make a distinction between what we consider clinically to be traumatic and what we believe most people are using in the community as traumatizing, right? Because sometimes people can say, oh man, I'm so traumatized by that. I don't want, the last time we went to that restaurant, something bad happened. Like my dad was so embarrassing to me. So I'm traumatized by that. And that certainly is the language that's being used right now. Used in that way describes a visceral aversive response or a negative reaction to something that might have happened. And certainly there is an elevated sense of dislike and perhaps a desire to avoid that situation because it's uncomfortable. It causes a level of discomfort. And whenever you go there, you're reminded of the time that that thing happened. And that can feel traumatizing. I don't want to minimize that. But I want to also make a distinction between that and clinical trauma, which in the clinical world, we would diagnose someone with a post-traumatic stress disorder. When we think about trauma and we try to translate that, then sometimes we use the word yang lashi bong pli. And that, when contextualized within that cultural framework, there is the notion of spiritual influences. You think that you don't bleed, there must you do to bleed the and so that captures part of trauma, but it doesn't fully capture what post-traumatic stress disorder might encompass, such as abusive history, being exposed to a lot of different types of abusive behaviors by another human being. And so when that happens in our Hmong culture, we don't really think about that as traumatic. And now we're using that language. So I don't mean to say that we're not using it now. We have the language for it now, but historically speaking, we would not think of it that way. So some key attitudes and things to look for when we're feeling traumatic or have been exposed to those type of traumatic experiences are being easily startled or fatigued, always being on guard because there's danger. And so we think that we're in danger and we're on guard when we're really not in danger. Maybe making some bad choices, having trouble sleeping, having trouble concentrating, being more irritable, being more hypervigilant, and experiencing an overwhelming guilt or shame. And it might look different with infants to school age children to teenagers to the adults. So it manifests differently and shows up very differently.
I definitely agree on that. And from a cultural perspective, I feel like I've seen a lot of individualized coping mechanisms to deal with stress. And so there seems to be a lack of direct communication or expression when there are traumatic experiences that have happened. From your professional experience, is there any evidence that the first generation Hmong, so that would be anyone who has directly experienced war and immigration, do they have different coping mechanisms than, let's say, the third generation Hmong, which would be only those that were born here in America?
Yeah, I think that when you're the one that is going through the trauma, and if we're talking about trauma specific to the war experience as refugees, where there is loss and grief, that is such a big part of that traumatic experience where you've had to leave your homes. And so you've lost everything that you've built your life around, or you've had to leave family members, whether deceased or not. You've witnessed losses right in front of you, whether they were shot down or not. And so there's that grief and loss that comes with the traumatic experiences of fleeing overnight and fearing for your life and dodging bullets, fearful that if you have an infant who's crying, you're going to be a target. And so some of that can be so overwhelming that in the moment, you're just on survival mode. So once you get to safety, whether it's Thai soil or even coming to the United States, the after effect of what had happened to you, the traumatic impact of that can be different for everyone. Some people might just block it out because it's too traumatic. Some people might be haunted by that through nightmares, through poor sleep. They may cope differently. And I think the first generation copes in a more healthy way, I would say, because they are still very tied to their community. And so after being resettled in the United States, they then convene in terms of secondary migration into Hmong communities that would give them the support system that they need. They cope by continuing some of the traditions that they have practiced in back in their old country. But the other coping mechanism is also not to talk about it. It's too hard to talk about it. And so some people might not even bring it up, but other people might talk about it all the time because it's such a pronounced piece of their history and the losses and the grief. So they're coping differently. And I think depending on how the first generation copes, it might impact those who weren't part of that first generation, the 1.5 generation or the second generation. So how they cope then becomes traumatic to their children, to the second generation. As an example, if they cope with unhealthy habits where they're drinking, they're withdrawn, they don't talk about it, and it builds up and they're more irritable, they're having a lot of nightmares, flashbacks, then they could be traumatizing to their children, meaning that those behaviors could be harmful to their children. Or they might say, don't trust this person, don't trust that person. They might project their own traumatic reactions onto their children. And that could also be abuse. It could be verbal abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse. It could be neglect because, they're drinking and doing all this stuff. But the other piece is the traumatized parents, right? Not necessarily traumatizing, but traumatized parents could be the ones where they shut down and they're emotionally unavailable. And so when they're not emotionally available, then children, the second generations, may have to fend for themselves and they may have to navigate through life as the adult, the parentified child, which also does something traumatizing to that second generation child.
Yeah, and as a second generation Hmong American myself, I've definitely seen the effects of what generational trauma has really done to our community. And to speak upon that further, when we talk about the stigmas that exist in the Hmong culture in regards to mental health, I feel like the only way we can talk about mental health is with the limited vocabulary that we have upon it, right? And so a word that comes to mind when I think about mental health is the word vu. And that word directly translates to crazy. And I feel like that is a pretty common word that is used in the context of mental health. And that word just has so much negative connotation and like stigma that's attached to it that when it comes up, you don't even want to bring up any mental health concerns because, that word not only reflects negatively on yourself, but also your family. And so I was wondering, in your work, have you seen that there's been any development in vocabulary around mental health?
Yes, that's a really good point. And I think language around mental health has been growing in the last 10 years or so. And this is in part due to generations like you who are trying to make sense of what the Hmong people have traditionally thought about mental health symptoms and questioning the words that we use and what language do we use. So you're right. Traditionally, the word "nyoshia" is a very broad catch-all terminology that encompasses what we would consider to be mental health, right? And so when we first started, the word mental health was oh, mo ke nyoshia la shi oh right? I think that was very, very, very early on in the 80s. It was because the only time that someone actually needs help and actually has to go see a professional is when they're struggling with their mental health at such a severe level that they are incapacitated, meaning that they're no longer able to carry out their regular day to day responsibilities. They are forgetful. They have poor concentration. They're running red lights. They're forgetful in that people tell them things and they're not always present. Mong hai tia yu chi bao yu tu kenya lang tu la na na ya. And so all of those words really mean that you are mentally incapacitated. Vậy thủ coi vừa là quá giờ có tôi hay lo nó hay lo tỏ thế tôi cũng tôi hay lên được con năm mới có chỉ tao tao có tới chính cho cá lên chỉ có vừa hồi yêu có chờ tăng đi là tăng lý chắc có chụp bài thế có nhà năng vừa mà we don't pay attention to someone until their mental health is to that level that the only explanation is that they are now crazy. When we have to step back and say, oh, the word mental health or the word depressed, when we think about it, it could mean a lot of things. But for the majority of our Hmong people, it just means life stressors. And so we often normalize that word to saying, oh, and we forget that there is that other end of the spectrum, which is the clinical depression, right? And so now we're developing the language to say, okay, got stressed out, sad, got worried. When you cross over to the clinical level, then And so that is a new word that we're introducing now in the community to say, yeah, be ona nya be mo genyo shiama. Ta shi to be ta za de ga mon ji itu ta mo wa ba de ne mo genyo shia ne ge thong de ga za kan o ga mo tu mo nyo shia le. E ga tili feng chi men ka tili no chi ga nya chi rong bu chi zhou zhe, o ra ji la de dong ta. Ta shi kan de ji cai dao de ga vu, kan de cai dao de ga mo tu mo le si. So we hope that that could help to destigmatize individuals who are struggling with clinical symptoms of mental health.
That's really promising to hear that there has been, consideration and development about the vocabulary that surrounds mental health, because that really does push who other people are comfortable talking about it, right? And so I was wondering, when you do introduce these new terms, concepts, and perspectives in terms of thinking about how we communicate about mental health, how we understand it, and how we internalize it, are you finding that the community is receptive to these changes, or is there still some resistance that surrounds this topic of mental health?
The approach has always been one of complementary suggestions. The approach has always been one of, if that's not working for you, let me introduce something else that might help. So it's never approached in the either or, it's both and. And when you approach it that way, it feels less challenging to someone
Mm-hmm.
else's belief system, but more of an invitation to consider something else. And even when we provide that approach, sometimes some clients are very convicted in their beliefs. Sometimes some clients may not have the mental capacity to be open to that, and it will prove to be a bit challenging, but they keep coming back. And I truly believe that when you first introduce a concept that is so foreign to the way someone has always lived their life, it does take time. And so I believe that that happens in phases. And the first phase is just the planting the seed phase. You're just dropping a thought. You're just suggesting something and letting it sit and letting it stay with that person. And they might initially reject it, but you have to trust that that seed has been planted. And in my experience, a large majority of the time, individuals start to adapt and think differently about their life. And for those who are open minded to doing that, they then begin to learn new skills to manage their mental health without feeling like they have to abandon old beliefs, unless those old beliefs and those old practices are harmful to where they want to go in their life.
And going off of that, the reason why I bring up language is because I've noticed that there is a language barrier that exists in the first, second, and so on generation Hmong. I can definitely attest to that for myself because, it is really hard to communicate these abstract concepts of, how an individual is feeling internally. And you mentioned planting a seed. So, what are some strategies that they could do to plant that seed to create that understanding and, facilitate that change? Because I feel like there is a lot of instances where people are probably experiencing trauma and mental health concerns, but they don't even know that it's been going on for years.
Well, I think that first of all, the language that you're talking about, that the second generation might be a bit removed from, exists. But it exists and it gets expressed through gutia. It gets expressed through bahua. And so it gets expressed in a different way. And so when we think about traditionally, how do people cope with soke koshia, right? Because there are these other words that we
Mm-hmm.
don't use necessarily in the community. And so y'all second generation or lechipolo mona, lechipola lo nyo shia su. Dash lechipo ya lo to hai dia koshia, tu shia, bo shia bonju, lu shia lunju. And so when we use those words, then that also suggests that clinical level of depression or mental health struggles. And so I don't mean to say that the other didn't exist earlier, and I wanted to kind of introduce this back, that là xin nữ tu xin nữ tu chu tu pli chim bua nữ lúc chạy là xin nữ bua xếp buồn chữ lúc xếp lên chữ là nó chạy thằng đó chạy ok giờ lên nó có yêu tâm thiệt cho cái ba giờ cho cái ba giờ tới rồi nhưng nhau ở năng ở dài tu pli đó họ yêu tu chu tu pli chim bua yêu lúc chạy là yêu thay lấy có share yêu thay lấy tu share giờ có share giờ có mù tọ tên ble có mù tọ tê mù hùng có mù cho tê mi nà mi nông thả mù mốc kia ta cho tê mi nà mi nông mù mốc có ít lo cho tê mi nà mi nông vậy lúc xuyên kỳ. So there are some of those coping mechanisms where you usually move hai lo lu cứ chia mà hai lu ba lu mà hai cho lu to hẹn or bé chỉ nên hú xí to hồ bé có conversations. It's not used in basic conversations. But when we began to step into this world of mental health treatment and we began to think about the Hmong language and we began to think about these deeper sets of phrases that often aren't part of our everyday conversations, then we can really touch the souls of those who are struggling. Because you come out lúc party cái nó cái house na, you tell oh có nhớ lại cha na, nhớ chỉ trong này à, em bây giờ họ nhớ chỉ trong này, bộ nhớ sẽ cần cầu này à, bộ sẽ bốn chữ ta này à. And then the other person might say, oh, sao nhớ sẽ, bây giờ có gì bé là nhớ sẽ dạng cầu thế, sao nhớ sẽ, and then we kind of just leave it at that, right? We don't say, bộ sẽ bốn chữ ya về lý cha na. We don't say that because we're not equipped to deal with that historically speaking. It's either you just symptoms that show it's all the other coping mechanisms that I mentioned, shamanism or soul calling, or you deal with it on your own with gutsia. I think that right now, what I'm seeing in the community that most people are more receptive to are the the older generation, for mental health in the way that so because mental health is a westernized concept in terms of mental health treatment, talk therapy, even though there is talk therapy in the Hmong community, which is through counseling with the elders. But that looks very different. Counseling with the elders is more of the thiết cho kia, thiết hải có cho lúc nên dùng chỉ mong mong cho chạy lò cá thiết lò cho kia từ tin nên đó nè. And talk therapy in the Western lens is more self-driven and asking, what are your goals? What would you like out of this? What's making you unhappy? Because of that, then most Hmong are more open to programming that is very similar to the way that they cope with it back in Laos. So some people will go to day program J Lao. Game nhớ chế lâu chế mù nhớ ok shit thả nhớ play bingo lo tua thu lo một cái shit rồi lo cái shit cá shia một gì uống gì nó một tờ trong một bảo bọn nó cái they really feel like that helps with their mental health. They really feel like that helps them to feel more at peace. It's a distraction coping mechanism. Because oftentimes is often brooding and ruminating over the things that are not going well in your life. So the planting of the seed starts with networking with individuals in agencies that provide the support and the services that the Hmong people are a little bit more familiar with. And so what we would do is we would connect with providers in the community, whether it's the folks who have the senior centers, whether it's case managers who go out and talk about their basic needs. And I'm just talking about the older people here because I think what your question is addressing is the challenges of having to plant the seed, right? And so when we start building those networks, and then when those individuals in those spaces see that yes, they're getting all of their basic needs met, but alleging still more coping mechanisms that are harmful to them, just still struggle with mental health symptoms that are debilitating to them, then they may say, oh, bao itu thamo e nu ba ja tin mo ke nyo shia. E kusa ka mun da nu tha. E ka mun da nu tha she nu bo da to ko te ke nyo shia thiên nu ba ko yin ko te ke nyo shia. And so when they do that, then people are a little bit more open to coming in because they already have that trust. They already have that relationship with that provider who then is sending them to us. So relationships are so important to part of the Hmong's way of living and into the Hmong's identity that once you have that person to connect to someone else, they're more willing to come. Versus, I think the younger generation, they recognize that they have mental health struggles, they Google it, and then they Google a provider, and they would much rather go see someone that no one knows because it's a very private struggle to them. And for the older generation, it's a completely different thing. They would much rather go to someone that was referred by someone that they know and trust.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I feel like, this just shows that there's not one appropriate approach to outreach to a community about mental health. This is a really abstract concept, regardless of if you have a base understanding of it or not. So you really need to look at who would be utilizing those services and think about how you would want to target those approaches. You make a good point that for the older generation, they might be looking for more of a communal approach, whereas in the younger generation, they might be looking for more individualized support. In your work, have you seen that there has been an increase in utilization for mental health services in the Hmong community as a whole?
I think more so in the Twin Cities than in other areas of the United States. I think in states like Wisconsin, where there's also a very large Hmong population, and in California, I think that there is an openness or a different understanding of the services that we as mental health providers can provide, but it's not at the same pace as here in the Twin Cities. So my perspective might be more based on the Twin Cities culture, which is that when we start seeing our home clients, and because I've been doing this for a while, I was able to see the changes through the years. And initially, a large percentage of the clients that we saw were mostly for disability cases, US citizenship cases, welfare renewal cases. So it really was to meet the basic needs of financial and medical waivers. Yet through the years, we're starting to see that we provide a lot of psychoeducation. We plant a lot of the seeds around the service that we can provide, which is complementary to some of the traditional healing practices that they're currently engaged in. And over time, they began to realize that there is a role that we have within that holistic wellness that has been missing. And so over time, we get a lot of referrals through word of mouth. And so yeah, de la banji itu tangje de bia ke nyo she je la da oh ko tung bung ji itu tamo ne ba ko cha ko te ke nyo she ne yin dao yu ta yin cha dao yu yin ble dao yu. And then they began to realize that there is value and there is benefit to a private conversation instead of mo do 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 no do wo ta e je jo to no i pa e to do yu ta yu da tamang e je le mo mo o lu tao lu sai. And so they realized that the individualized mental health services that we provide, which is less advising and more guiding, is therapeutically beneficial to their own growth and their own mental health journey. So now we get a lot of people just calling and wanting to come in and saying, I know someone who comes there and they referred me to you. And so now it's not just the referrals from providers and our networks. Now it's referrals from our clients to their community members. So there is definitely that shift that we're seeing.
I appreciate that. And I think it's a positive sign that there is an increase in utilization. But how do you keep people invested to keep continuing to evaluate their mental health and utilizing services?
Well, we know that not just within the Hmong community, but across the board, the utilization of mental health services or the number of sessions, the median number of sessions is one. And that's because the journey into understanding our own mental health and managing our own mental health can be very painful and is a lot of work and can be hard to examine. It's not just with the Hmong community, but with most people. There's a lot of ambivalence at first in seeking mental health services. There is a lot of fear in looking inside and trying to address that. And if you think about mental health services, it's very patient driven and patient labor heavy. What I mean by that is when you go there, you're physically presenting yourself there, but they pretty much do most of the work for you. They examine you, and then if it needs surgery, they do the surgery. If, the only thing that you do is you take the medication, but everything else they do for you. Whereas in mental health services, you have to do the hard work. And if you don't do the hard work, you're not going to see growth or change. We can provide the guidance, we can provide the observations, we can provide the recommendations, but really you have to have that openness, that commitment, right? That belief, that faith, and that hope. And then you have to take those steps to make those changes in order to work. So it is very difficult. And so to keep them coming back is really to stay present with them, to pace the sessions according to their comfort level. I always say the best clinicians are the one that knows that dance, how much to push and when to just pause and sit with the clients so that they're feeling like they're moving at a pace that challenges their growth but doesn't push them out of their comfort zone. So that's one strategy. Another strategy is really to provide feedback, some reflection on you've been seeing me for X number of sessions, and what I'm noticing are these changes in you. And sometimes we don't notice the changes in us until someone recognizes it, because I always say therapy is like watching a flower bloom. You can't see it bloom right in front of your eyes. But if you walk away from that and you come back, you see that it's already blossomed a little bit. And so I often say, don't think about whether you're changing as you're talking. Don't think about whether there's benefits from a minute by minute perspective or hour by hour perspective, but think about it as 3 sessions in, and are you feeling different? 6 months in, are you feeling different? And I think that most people aren't used to that model of treatment. And so they really see that immediate effect and they apply that same expectations to therapy. And therapy isn't like that. Therapy is a process. And therapy takes time and patience because your subconscious beliefs, your emotions, many times have been suppressed for as long as you've been, alive. And for a lot of adults, it's 20, 30, 40 years. So it takes some time to rework that.
I feel like it's really important to emphasize that we need to meet people where they're at, right? We can't really force people to mold into a certain perspective, but we really need to just come to an understanding that there are individual and community perspectives that need to be considered when we are, talking about topics like mental health. And that leads me to our last question here, which is how can the Hmong community focus on becoming happier together?
Yeah, that's a really good but tough question. The word together, I think, is key, especially because we're living in a capitalist society where the self is really critical to our well being and our success and how we think our quality of life should be. So, when we think about quality of life, it could translate into financial stability, it could translate into self happiness. And so the word self is counter to the word together. And I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying we need to then think about what are some elements of our collective being that has been such a beautiful part of our culture. And so, what does happiness as a collective people mean in this changing world where now we've been in the US for 40, 50 years? How do we adapt that? Because to be collectively happy in the way that we thought we were back in Laos 40 plus years ago does not work here. It really is thinking about that because that collective value in its purest form is no longer relevant. So how do we redefine that to us, right? And what I would suggest, instead of going into details, because it's different for everyone, right, is to assess and think through what has been good about our collectiveness and keep that, and what has been harmful about our collective practices and let that go. And in return, what has been good about our individual practices that has been good, and what has been harmful about this new individualistic perspective that is hurtful to us as Hmong people. I remember a time when, because I came to the States when I was 7, so I'm quite bicultural in my exposure. I've been exposed to the way Hmong people have lived, and I've been exposed to the way Hmong Americans have lived. And when we first came to the States, I remember that there was so much excitement and happiness. And back then we had phone books, so you'd go to like a phone stand. I know it feels like that was decades ago. That was where they would have a telephone booth in public, maybe by a gas station, and you would go there if you went to a new town, and you would flip through the pages of the phone book, and you would flip through all the last names of the Hmong people, Chang, Hers, Lors, Taos, and and you would call up that Hmong person, and all you had to say is, "Oh, blah blah blah," and they would invite you to their house because that was just how we were. They just Flu in that way, and it didn't matter if you were a stranger. Got your family. And even more so, con take the sang mong valley because I'm a vein, right? You can mong valley, oh, Colombia Illinois, Beto Hojana, Besa Pada Mama, Be a mong va, and then it's like automatically your relatives now, right? Even though you don't know each other. And so I think that that's such a beautiful part of our Hmongness, our Hmong collective Hmongness that we have lost. 但是呢，被把蒙了，被害的影响蒙的跌了是，被人只摸着给是路的大领的了，被只摸着给是得了是贴。So how do we become happier together? I think it's doing some of that reflective work for our own self. What are some key components of our Hmong culture that is so critical to our sense of self, that is so critical to our being centered and grounded in who we are as a Hmong person? But lastly, it's just important for us to remember, as we're talking about becoming happier together or living happier together, is that we all want the same things in life. Essentially, that's what we want, is the same thing, which is to be happy and to live harmoniously together. Very few people want to live alone, but we choose to live alone because to live together is more toxic and harmful to us. And so we separate ourselves, which then gives us peace. And over time, we begin to just kind of get used to that individualistic lifestyle. But as social beings, I think that we would much prefer to be living harmoniously together. And that is why we've now adopted the notion of, we have a choice to pick our friends. And so we tend to socialize with our friends. We tend to hang out with people that are more like-minded, and we abandoned the Hmong ways of and now the younger generation are like, no, I don't have the same values as them. Why would I go? I'm happier when I choose to hang out with the people that gets me. But family is so important. And guess who's there for us? Our family. And so we have to really work at how to move towards the middle with the relationships that are most important to us, which is our family, so that we can be happier collectively.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alyssa, for overviewing what mental health currently looks like for the Hmong community and just how far we've come since coming here to the United States. It really has been a transformative experience that we've collectively as a community experienced together. And of course, there's going to be growing pains, but as you mentioned, the importance of collectiveness in the Hmong community is a really important grounding point because this has always been a core value for the Hmong people. And I want to thank you for your expertise throughout this episode. In the description, I've linked some some of Dr. Alyssa Kaying Vang's social information on how you can reach out to her or her organization and learn more about what she's doing. Thank you all for listening to this podcast, and I hope that we can continue to become happier together.